Hello, my name is Julie, and it's time to talk about all the books that I read in June. Yep, sorry it's a little bit late. I wanted to get my mid-year book freak out first and also my readathon announcement, so if you haven't seen either of those, please go check those out, especially Friendathon. I am so very excited about this year's round. I think we've got some really excited prompts and my personal TBR, stacked. But in June, I read 12 books, which is very average for me lately. And I read a total of 4,556 pages, which is the second most I have read in a month this year. I had an average rating of 3.81, which is again the second best that I've had this year. I have 2 books I think I'm giving a 5-star. The average book that I read was 379 pages long, and I read about 151 pages per day. I read 4 books that I had already owned, added 1 book to my TBR. So for the year, I have a -5 net TBR. Star ratings are again a great bell curve, with 4 stars being my biggest category. As for genres, let's look at how perfectly split this is. I read 5 genres that had 2 books and 2 genres that I read 1 book from. I read mostly standalones with 1 concluding novel. I read 1/3 audiobooks and 16% young adult books. So let's get straight into my reviews. The first book that I read was Rees Fall by Vajra Chandrasekhara. This is a science fiction weird novel. I got an arc of this from Tor and it is out now, so you can read it. This is a very hard to describe book, but it's told in a series of short stories that are interconnected by the same characters living different lives throughout time. It's not a very easily pinned down book, and this really takes a lot of work to be able to understand what was going on. And I'm going to tell you, I did not understand what was going on. I did not feel like there were strong threads throughout this. It felt like this was a collection of short stories, and the author was kind of shoving these supposedly same characters into these. There were a couple of stories in here that I really liked, and they were toward the beginning. And then as the book went on, I'm like, oh, nothing's actually resolving. I'm not really following. Is this one world? Is this a multiverse? I feel like I just did not understand the words that were being said to me. So maybe I didn't give this enough of a shot. This could be for other people, but I don't think that this format or this story was for me. I got a couple of our themes, but I didn't think I had a grasp on this at all. And I also did not feel rewarded for the work that I put into trying to understand this book. I would say the first maybe like 4 stories, I was engaged. I'm like, okay, I have to work hard for this. But like the further we went on, I didn't understand what these characters and stories had to do with each other, if they were even in the same universe. I really like an esoteric book, but this was too out there for me to even make heads or tails of it. So in some places I've said I'm giving it no rating, in some places I've said I'm giving it a 2-star. I just didn't enjoy my time with this, and I had really high expectations of liking it. I don't think the author is a bad writer. I just didn't get it. It wasn't for me personally. Then for my 12 books, 12 friends, 12 months challenge, in which some of my mutuals give me books that they loved, that they think I would, I read The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. This was picked out by my friend Imogen, who knows my taste pretty well. I have read Roshani Chokshi in the past. I have said, you know what, I think her writing's great. I don't think that story's for me. I keep saying I'll give her another shot, and this was finally a real win. This is a gothic novel. Some people call it a fantasy. I don't think it is. We have our main character, the bridegroom, who is married to this very rich, mysterious woman. He's obsessed with fairy tales, and her life feels like a fairy tale, and when he is taken back to her manor family estate because her aunt is dying, he starts trying to investigate what happened with her and her best friend back in the past when they were friends in high school and the friend disappeared. I thought that this was so wonderfully written. I think that some people could definitely think that this is like purple prose, but I actually really got into it. This is essentially trying to write a new fairy tale. It feels very whimsical and sometimes dark. It gave a really great tone that captured exactly the feeling that the author was going for. Not a lot happens in this book. It's not plot heavy. It's more about characters and vibes and feelings, and the feelings of these characters kind of controlling each other almost. I don't know if this is trying to have a really big plot twist or if it's trying for you as the reader to know it immediately, but I have read the plot twist of this book a million times and knew what it was within the first couple of chapters. If this had nailed that ending, I think it could have been a 5-star, but I thought that this was just really successful in building tone. So I'm giving this like a 4.25, very great recommendation for me, and I will be recommending it to other people. Then I listened to The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. This is a little bit speculative historical fiction that is about a plantation of slaves, and the main characters are these two men who are enslaved and are in a relationship with each other, and it's been kind of a known secret, but when another enslaved man gets really into the white man's religion, he decides to start trying to ostracize these two men, and that leads to a chain of events of everything blowing up at this plantation. This is an ensemble piece, so we get perspectives from a ton of different people here. We get a lot of different perspectives from people who are enslaved on this plantation, as well as some of the slave owners. This is really well crafted in that I think it covers a lot of like the social politics of the time. For example, how some enslaved people would try to gain power how they could so they could beat down on other people, and the same with white women at the time finding ways to beat down on the enslaved people. And I thought that this really had a lot to say about what we don't talk about with slavery. I thought that it covered a lot of things that would happen to enslaved people without being overly gratuitous. Here's the thing, one, there are so many characters that it is really hard to keep track of them. I thought that that was maybe an experience that I was having because I was listening to the audiobook, but I have heard people who read the book physically say the exact same thing. And I also was really put off by like the speculative twist of this book. I did not know going into it that there was any speculative element, and it felt like it was just kind of appearing at the end without really being built up. But I don't know how long that this story is going to particularly stay with me because we split so much time between a very wide cast of characters. So I'm giving this like a 3.75. I think it is well done, but there were things that made this harder to follow for me. Then for my book club, 3 of Clubs, this last quarter we read books about friends to lovers. This quarter has ended, so if you'd like to join us for this next quarter, we're going to be reading books about rogues, so thieves, assassins, spies. Join us in the Discord for that. And our last book that was chosen for that theme was voted on by the group, and we read A Lady for a Duke by Alexis Hall. This is a book that I never would have picked up on my own. I had literally never read like a proper historical romance before. This was not even on my radar, but I do think that this was a good pick for the club because there were things that we could definitely discuss. This is about our main character Viola, who is a trans woman who was a soldier at Waterloo and was able to fake her own death and live her life as her true self, but that meant that she had to sever ties with everyone but her blood relatives, and her best friend is deeply in mourning, suffering from PTSD. She finds out about this and is sent to take him out of this depression, but she is instructed to not tell him who she is. I will say, the first 200 pages of this 500-page book, perfect, fantastic. And then it decides to have what is usually the third act conflict of a book that early on. And at first I was like, oh, this is such a great change of pace that we're going to be doing something different instead of the usual structure of a book. But then it was 300 pages of nothing but boring. It felt like there were no stakes going on. Even though in real life, yes, there will be a lot of obstacles of these characters being together, but it did not feel like that in the logic of this book. It felt like they were just being like, oh, we can't be together. And the last bit was mostly about a character who wasn't even one of our main characters. Even though the first 200 pages were so emotional, talking about things that a lot of Regency books don't cover, it felt like that just went away. I did like that this is about a trans main character in historical fiction, and the conflict is not that people are having a problem with her being trans. Obviously that comes into the plot, but the problem is not that the people who love her aren't accepting her, and I think that that makes this a pretty safe book to read. But I just thought the plotting of this really left a lot to be desired in the second half. So what could have been a 5-star turned out to be like a 3.5. Speaking of 3 stars, I read Less by Andrew Sean Greer. This book somehow won the Pulitzer, but this is about our main character, Arthur Less, who is a middle-aged gay man. Most of his life he was in relationships with older men, and then most recently he was, for the first time, with a much younger man. And after dating him for 9 years, they ended up breaking up. After only a couple of months, the ex-boyfriend is engaged to somebody else, and Arthur Less is also an author, and he's been struggling to write his next book. So he decides to run from his problems and travel around the world, taking different author and writing related gigs to try to jumpstart his life into something he wants. This is the sort of like midlife crisis book that you expect it to be. There were a lot of fun comedic things that our character gets into, but I ultimately felt like you knew what this book was getting into from the very beginning, and it didn't really go anywhere else than what you expected it to. I think it was great to see from a perspective that I hadn't really seen from before, which is a gay man in his 50s. So I just ended up giving this a 3 star. I don't think there was anything particularly wrong with this book. I just don't think I'll ever think about it again. Then I read The Water Outlaws by S.L. Huang. This is a martial arts Chinese-inspired fantasy by an author who is actually a Hollywood stunt performer. So this is about our main character who is the arms master for the emperor, and a higher up attempts to assault her. She pushes back and he retaliates, leading her to be set for execution. She has some friends who rescue her from that fate and end up bringing her into exile to this group of outlaws who are actively working against the Empire. And the Empire is all she's ever known. We also have a character who is working in the Emperor's lab, sort of against her will, to discover a new type of way to create a magical artifact that can increase someone's martial arts ability. I said it so much in my vlog, this reminded me of He Who Drowned the World specifically. This is a very solid debut fantasy, and I will definitely be picking up this author in the future. I thought the plot of this was so strong, and I really liked how this discussed morality, because it definitely never portrays the outlaws as good guys. Basically, anybody we meet in this book is an anti-hero or just straight up a villain, but there are some people who are better than others by a mile. I was not particularly invested in our characters, and there were perspectives that I really preferred over others, but I thought that this was a really cool fantasy standalone in developing enough of this world that it felt like you understood the stakes, and also explaining the magic just enough so that you had fun with it while also understanding the mechanics of it. So I look forward to reading more from S.L. Huang in the future, and I gave this a 4 star. Then I read Iris Kelly Doesn't Date by Ashley Herring Blake. This is the 3rd and final book in the Bright Falls trilogy, which is a series of interconnected standalone romances where different people in the same friend group are all getting into romantic relationships. This was the synopsis of the 3 books that I was least interested in, but I think this ended up being my favorite. Our main character Iris is a romance author, and she is struggling to write her next book. Shocker, I've read so many books like that lately. After multiple failed relationships, she is really shunning having serious romantic relationships and only wants to do casual sexual relationships. And everyone in her life is really getting on her case about that. And our other main character, Stevie, got out of a very long-term relationship when her ex-girlfriend dumped her for one of their friends. Even though she really wants a relationship, her anxiety gets so bad it's crippling in that department. Iris is really good at sexual relationships. Stevie's really good at romantic relationships. Through a series of events involving a failed one-night stand and lying that causes fake dating, they decide to teach each other how to do one type of relationship or the other. This one might have had a little bit of a rocky start, but by the end, I was so incredibly invested in their relationship. I thought that the dichotomy between them was so good because they have some things they are so similar about, but they will react to in entirely different ways. I felt like they were very well matched for each other. And this took some tropes that I think that are entirely overused and did them in a way that I actually enjoyed them again. I think where this really succeeded was the 3rd act conflict, which is so make or break for me when it comes to a romance book, So many books I've really liked until that last bit, and this, I think the third act really was paid off. It was set up well, it felt fairly realistic. That is where Ashley Herring Blake's books have in the past lost me. I have loved the first part, and then the third act conflict feels too short and too much like an overreaction, versus this one I think really, really worked. So this is up there with some of my favorite romances of all time now, and I do think I am going to be giving it a 5-star. Then I listened to Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. This is a literary fiction, a little bit of historical fiction, where our main characters are two siblings who are kind of estranged from each other after one of them tried to come out to their family, and now she's estranged from them, but their mother ends up dying, and she has left behind a 8-hour-long recording telling them everything she never told them about her life. She's also left a cake that she would make for special occasions in the freezer for them to eat while they listen to the recording. This book was one of the most talked about literary fictions of the year it came out, and I definitely get why. I really like an audio recording in a book. I really like an ensemble piece, and I think that this did end up doing an ensemble piece by the end of it. I personally was more a fan of the modern timeline than the past timeline. Even though I haven't read that many books about people from the Caribbean, I felt like I had read the story of the mom before. It didn't feel particularly new to me, and even when really emotional things happened, it felt like something I'd seen before. But for some reason, seeing the kids react to their mom's story was really emotionally impactful to me. And I really loved how all of our threads tied together by the end. So at the beginning of this book, I was less of a fan, but by the end, I was really enjoying it. There were a lot of discussions about identity in this book that I think a lot of people will connect to, and anybody who loves a messy family, I think will really get along with this. I like that every single person has been wronged and has wronged others within the family, and I thought that that was a really interesting dynamic to read about, so I ended up giving this a 4. Then I read I Feed Her to the Beast and the Beast Is Me by Jamison Shea. This is a YA horror novel about our main character, who is a black girl who is at the Paris Ballet Academy. She is at the top of every single one of her classes, and she is determined to get into the Paris Ballet Company. But when perfect isn't good enough, because the company doesn't want to accept a black person into their ranks, our main character looks to one of the stars of the company who has had incredible luck, and it turns out she has been using powers that she gained from some sort of demonic entity she entered into an agreement with, and our main character decides to do the same. If you love the movie Black Swan, this is something that you should read. I really liked how the horror element blended into the realistic parts of this book, how our main character is standing up for things that happen to her, but she's not doing it in a healthy way. I think our main character is a really interesting one to follow. She's not always making the best decisions, but you're ultimately rooting for her because what's happening to her is entirely unjust. While I liked what type of horror this was, I did think that my interest in it waned over the course of the book, where I didn't feel like more things were being added to it, or I felt like we were kind of hitting the same notes over and over again. I also wasn't interested in the romance that this tries to set up, but just talking about our main character's journey, I thought this was pretty good, so I gave it a 3.5. Then I listened to I'm the Girl by Courtney Summers. This is the spiritual successor to Sadie, which is a book I loved when it came out. And this is about our main character, Georgia, who doesn't have a lot of money to her name, and all she wants in this world is to be an Aspera girl, which is this golf club that's nearby, and she associates it with power and getting everything she's ever wanted. But that place also chewed up and spit out her mother, and her mother was like, you're never going there, but her mom's dead and she is determined to become an Aspera girl. However, our main character also comes across the body of a dead girl, and while she is trying to get in with the higher ups at Aspera, she is also getting pulled into investigating the murder with the sister of the dead girl. This book was hard to read. I really had to put it down several times because our main character is a teenager who does not know any better and does not have like safety alarm bells. Like, she does not understand when she is in danger. She thinks that she is invincible and that nothing bad could ever happen to her, even when bad things keep happening to her. And I'm like, there is not a responsible adult in sight. It was so hard to read because you know it is inevitable that something terrible is going to happen to our main character, worse than that's already happened. I don't think anything is particularly surprising to the reader, but it is very harrowing to see how young girls can get manipulated and taken advantage of and be made to take the blame for the things that happen to them. If you liked My Dark Vanessa, that this might be a book that you could be interested in. It's not like a one-to-one comparison, but I feel like the perspective characters that we follow are pretty similar. It's hard to rate this book because it was such a hard read. I think I'm gonna give it a 4-star and would recommend it sparingly. Then I finally got around to, again for my 12-12-12 challenge, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. This is the 3rd book in the Year of Sanderson. I mean, isn't this the most gorgeous thing you've ever seen in your whole life? I also love the wide release cover. This is an Asian-inspired fantasy where we have 2 characters who lead very different lives. Yumi lives in a ancient-feeling society where she is this religious figure who is never given a break or time to be herself, and Painter is a boy who lives in a modern type city where it's always night, and he is a painter who chases away nightmares. And through some strange circumstance, they end up body swapping and having to inhabit the other person's body where the other person's spirit is watching and guiding them. It's just such a unique setup of a book. I really loved hearing about his inspirations from this and how so many different pieces came into this. I loved the fantasy elements of it. I liked that we have 2 different fantasy jobs and how our main characters are having to teach each other how to be the other person. Some of the most unique world building that Brandon Sanderson has done, which is saying something. And I really like the relationship between these 2, how they are constantly spending time with each other, but they still have so much longing for each other. I was really rooting for these 2, and as the plot went further, I was just flipping the pages more and more. There was some pacing stuff that wasn't entirely my favorite. There was definitely some info dumping, but I also didn't know a better way to do it than how he did. But the reveals in this were so crazy that, like, I don't think a single human being could ever guess it. So I thought that this was really successful, but ultimately there were a couple things holding it back from being a new favorite Sanderson. So I'm giving this a 4.5 star. Then the last book I read in June was The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. I picked this up randomly from my library just for Pride Month. And this is an ensemble novel, but it is mostly about our main character, Nia, who is someone who works on a lot of freighters on faster than light travel ships. So there are so many people in her life who have aged past her and died. So she doesn't have as many connections to other people and doesn't really have something grounding her. And through a set of circumstances, she comes to be the caretaker of a young boy who seems to have some sort of magical power about him, and he cannot speak. So sometimes we're following the perspectives of those 2 characters, but we also follow a bunch of characters who are outside of them, explaining different parts of the world and observing these 2 from the outside. And I thought that this was just so fantastic. This is a almost 400-page book, and it's only 14 chapters long, but I felt so engaged. I was flipping through this as fast as humanly possible. I did not want to put it down, which is great because I didn't have a whole lot of time to read it. And I became very attached to our main characters. I think if you like found family and don't mind like bad things sometimes happening to the found family, that this is a book that you should definitely try. I think sometimes the ensemble bit or flowing from character to character might not gel with everybody, but I thought that the way that this was told was so fantastic. I really loved the amount of world building we got and when to stop doing world building and focus on the relationships of the characters. While I was reading this, I was just obsessed about the way that this was told as well as the story itself. I've heard mixed things about Simon Jimenez's books, so I'm so glad that I ended up giving this a try, but I think I'm giving this a 5-star. And I did want to mention that all of these books I mentioned are queer books written by out queer authors if you'd like to pick up some more books to read queer all year. But those are all the books that I read in in June. Please let me know what you read. What were the best books that you read in June? Maybe there's something that I should pick up. And if you've read any of these, let me know what you thought. If you'd like to follow me anywhere, you can find me at the single link in the description to everything I do on the internet, my Instagram, my Goodreads, my Etsy, the Discord for my book club. Make sure to hit subscribe if you'd like to see more from me. And as always, I will see you in the next one.